Well, Taiwan has thanked Australia for bluntly telling Chinese President Xi Jinping, Chinese dictator Xi Jinping, to not invade it, and declared that the government's strong comments, Australian government's strong comments, are helping avoid conflict in the region. Absolutely. Peace comes through strength. Another Ronald Reagan quote. In an interview with the Australian, Foreign Minister Joseph Wu thanked Australia, and he said, "As I say all the time, I have a kangaroo in my heart." And he was pointing to his kangaroo lapel. Great bloke. Joining me now is Liberal MP and former Howard Minister Kevin Andrews, who writes brilliantly in The Spectator Australia on many topics, but recently in particular on China, Japan, Taiwan and relations within the region. Kevin, it's great to see you. How are you?
Wonderful to be with you, Rowan.
Well, thanks, Kevin. You're in Canberra there. Now, you've written in this week's upcoming Spectator about the Winter Olympics, about China. Do you believe we should boycott the Winter Olympics in China? And if so, why?
I've urged the Prime Minister and my colleagues to impose a diplomatic boycott on the Winter Olympics. China's record in terms of its breach of international rules, its human rights abuses, particularly in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, what it's doing in Hong Kong to what was formerly a free part of China. You can go on and on and on. China is thumbing its nose at the international norms, and somehow the international community must say to China quite clearly that we don't accept this, we're not going to put up with this type of behaviour. And one way to do it is to say, well, diplomatically, we're not going to turn up to your Winter Olympics.
Now, Kevin, we've come quite a way from the days of Gough Whitlam. We might talk about that in a second. But shamefully, I think, quite recently, Australian companies like Qantas, for example, refused to even mention Taiwan's name. Now, as I said, we've come a long way from that now. Peter Dutton has spoken up in suggesting Australia would come to the defence of Taiwan. Just tell us a little bit, well, first of all, can China be deterred from its clear and outspoken ambition to take Taiwan?
Oh, I think China can be deterred. China acts in a bullying way towards all its neighbours. In fact, it's in border disputes with about 17 of its neighbours at the present time, not just Taiwan, but Japan, even North Korea, India on the other side of the Chinese nation, and let alone all the others. So China's acting in this way, but the rest of the world in concert has to say that we're not going to accept this. We're not going to accept your bullying behaviour, and there will be consequences if you try to do something untoward, particularly in relation to Taiwan. Taiwan is not subordinate to China. The Taiwanese people have a wonderful free democracy there. That's a constitutional democracy. They've moved over 7 decades from what was an autocratic rule to a very vibrant democratic state. And we as democratic nations around the world should be upholding that democracy in Taiwan. If the Taiwanese people decided one day that they wanted to be part of the People's Republic of China, well, that's a different matter. But for China simply to suggest it's going to walk in there and invade China is something which should not be accepted, and we have to keep saying, as we're doing, and indeed as President Biden is doing and Secretary of State Antony Blinken, that there will be consequences if China thinks it can somehow invade Taiwan.
Now, Kevin, one of the things I love about your writing is you always sprinkle in little bits of history and those great details. As I said, we've come a long way. Take us back to the days of Gough Whitlam. And when you understand Gough Whitlam's kind of acquiescence to the demands of Communist China, you then start to understand maybe Paul Keating, who was very recently saying, attacking Peter Dutton for suggesting we would defend Taiwan. So take us through that sort of journey from Gough through Keating to where we are now.
Well, back in the early 70s, there were decisions taken by Gough Whitlam and by others, Richard Nixon, in the United States, in relation to recognising the People's Republic of China, that is the Communist Party regime on mainland China. What's remained uncertain since then is actually the status of Taiwan. Under the approach to China that both the US and Australia has taken, that matter has not been resolved. We haven't acceded to the claims of China that Taiwan is necessarily part of the People's Republic of China. But more importantly, the Taiwanese people themselves have built a separate democracy. They've said, their president, President Xi, has said just recently that this is a constitutional democracy. We're not subordinate to the PRC, nor is the PRC subordinate to us. We will do what the will of the Taiwanese people want. And surely a country of 25 million people, which is a free democracy like we are, should be prepared to stand up for a country of 24 million people, which is also a democracy, namely Taiwan.
Tell us about Paul Keating, because you wrote recently in The Spectator about Paul Keating came out kind of with the opposite argument, saying, "Oh no, we should, we misunderstand China. They're a peace-loving mob that we should be cozying up to," or words to that effect. I'm obviously paraphrasing.
Well, Mr. Keating is simply wrong on this. China is externally aggressive towards all the countries around it. It is internally repressive. We've seen these so-called re-education camps where hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Uyghurs have been locked up. We've seen all sorts of abuses of human rights to anybody who has a different view to the Chinese Communist Party. We should not be kowtowing to President Xi. But we also should look at what the weaknesses of China are. China's got a very rapidly ageing population. It's got a very weak economy. It's got a huge property bubble at the present time. It's reliant overly on its state-owned enterprises. There are lots of deficiencies in China, and many commentators, economists included, are predicting that China is reaching its peak at the present time. So for us to kowtow to China and think that somehow, that's all going to be great and we can just continue to trade and it's not going to impose its will on the rest of the world is just crazy. If you look at our exports, something like 98% of our exports by volume travel through the Indo-Pacific area, and about half of that through the South China Sea. Do we want all that subject to a dictatorial regime which can tell us when we can, move through the South China Sea or through the East China Sea or what? If we want peace in that area, which is what we fundamentally want, then we have to be prepared to stand up to China, because it will keep pushing the line further and further unless we say this is where it stops.
And Kevin, just very briefly, you drew in your recent article parallels between Japan and Formosa, which was the original name of Taiwan. Just tell us briefly about that link there.
Well, the interesting thing about Japan is that it's certainly strengthening not only its rhetoric, but what it's doing militarily in terms of defence. They're moving missile bases to islands closer to Taiwan. And the interesting connection is that the great-grandfather of the new Japanese Prime Minister actually lived and worked in what was then Formosa, Taiwan, for a period of time before returning to Japan about a century ago. So there's actually a personal link between the new Prime Minister of Japan and actually Taiwan itself. And certainly the rhetoric of the leaders of Japan over the last few years has strengthened in terms of regarding Taiwan as democratic, of saying to China, we will not put up with you marching into Taiwan. And I think this is happening right around the region. The Philippines has come out strongly. Indonesia, just in the last week, has said we're not going to give up islands to China in the South China Sea. Vietnam has come out in relation to the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Archipelago. So what President Xi is managing to do is unite the rest of the world and the rest of the region against him, simply because of the way in which he's going about what he's doing. There's these wolf warrior tactics, this bullying, this flying, jets over the military aircraft over the Taiwanese air defence zone, etc., etc. That is having the impact of uniting the rest of the world and the rest of the region against China.
Kevin Andrews, always great to chat to you and always great to read you there in The Spectator Australia. Terrific writing. Keep it up, and thanks so much for coming on Inside the News this evening.
My pleasure, Rowan.